Banditos. Welcome to another episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Mike Farah, and today we have another great interview for you today. It is with Andy Diggle, the writer behind such things as 2000 AD, where he was also an editor, Hellblazers, Lady Constantine, The Losers, Swamp Thing, Adam Strange, Green Arrow Year One, which was adapted into a TV show where they named a character John Diggle after the writer, Andy Diggle. He's worked a lot with the artist Jock. He has done work at Marvel and DC, as you can tell. And now he has a great new project diving back into the world of Elseworlds, Gotham by Gaslight, which was the first Elseworlds project. And he's really blowing that out for a project called Gotham by Gaslight, the Kryptonian Age. So you're going to see more than just sort of that Victorian age Batman. You're going to see more members of the Justice League. It is out now. Go get it. And this is our interview with Andy Diggle. Well, Andy, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're going to start you out with the same question we do with all our guests, which is, how did you first discover comic books?
Ooh, first discovered comic books. Well, I've got two older brothers, so I guess I discovered comic books by reading the stuff that they got. I'm super old, so I was a kid in the 70s in London, and my brothers, I think my parents got my brothers a subscription to the Beano, a British kids comedy comic. So that's probably the first thing I ever read. And it wasn't really my thing particularly, but it was there, so I'd read it. And I got my brother's old Asterix books, which I loved. But they were great. Like English translations of Asterix. And I would read like the occasional war comic like Battle Picture Weekly and stuff like that, and Commando. So I was always reading some kind of comics in my early childhood, but it was when I was 10 years old, around like 1981, that I discovered 2000 AD. And that was it. That was the thing. It just completely blew my head off. It was amazing, you know. And looking back on it now, though, the early 80s were a real golden age for 2000 AD. I thought, you know, like after I discovered 2000 AD, I would measure everything else against that, you know. And it wasn't until later years that I realized that that early 80s stuff was like a really high bar for quality. And like half of the creators who were doing stuff there, you know, writers and artists at that time, you know, went on to become mega stars. You know, it was kind of Kevin O'Neill and Alan Moore and, you know, Carlos Ezquerra, Steve Dillon. I mean, literally the first issue I bought, which cost about 12 pence, had like a front cover by Brian Bolland and a back cover by Steve Dillon, you know, and that's just the covers, you know, it's amazing. So yeah, and it was kind of disreputable in a way that you didn't get in kids' entertainment back then. It was kind of like, it was almost like, you know, for the kids who weren't allowed to go and see the X-rated movies and stuff like that. So we would get our kind of fill of extreme violence and horror and weird sci-fi ideas and disrespect for authority from this weekly source, you know, that our parents didn't really know about. So that was amazing. And I guess a couple of years later, I discovered Warrior, which was the original home of like Marvel Man and stuff like that, and V for Vendetta. I was probably too young to be reading it. I guess I was about 13 then. But again, it's like, you know, this is the good stuff, you know. And a couple of years after that, I discovered Swamp Thing, about 1985. I hadn't really got into American comics yet. I dabbled a bit with Amazing Spider-Man and Conan the Barbarian. John Buscema was doing it. But I never really stuck with either of them. But when I only bought Swamp Thing on a whim. I just saw it was in the local newsagent. So he had a big stack of American comics on the counter that he was getting ready to go and put on the shelf next to all the magazines. And it's just because the comic that was on the top of the pile had this like swamp monster standing over a dead dinosaur, and Batman and Hawkman standing behind him, like, you know, they were like secondary to whoever this monster guy was, and had this big, giant, lurid orange and yellow title, Swamp Thing. I thought that looks like something my parents wouldn't approve of. I totally need to buy it. So yeah, I just picked it up on a whim, and not knowing it was written by the guy who had written, you know, V for Vendetta and Marvel Man and Warrior, and had written Halo Jones in 2000 AD. didn't really think about who the creators were. It was just another comic, you know. But of course, all the stuff I was responding to was Alan Moore. Um, yeah, and it would turn out that was the Crisis on Infinite Earths crossover issue of Swamp Thing. And because I hadn't really read American comics before, I had no idea who any of these characters were. You know, there's references to Lex Luthor and this kind of stuff. I'm like, who? You know, I didn't know. But it was amazing. And it also, that issue featured John Constantine, who I'd never seen or heard of before. But like, and all these different universes are colliding into each other and weird, horrific stuff is going on. And it was totally baffling, but it was a ride, you know. And I'm like, I don't really know what's going on, but there's this chain smoking British bloke in a trench coat taking the piss out of Batman. And like, I want to read more of this guy, you know. And that's, I think it was really Swamp Thing that kind of put me on the path to becoming like more of a collector of comics, you know. Like that sent me off on my first ever trip to Forbidden Planet to go to become a dollar bin bandit. In fact, you know, to go rummaging through the back issues, you know, to kind of like complete my collection because I wanted to see how Swamp Thing had got to this point. And then it was the first book I really stuck with. Like every month, I'd have to make sure I got it. So I guess that's the short version. It wasn't that short, was it? The short version of how I got into comics.
Oh, that's okay. So couple questions coming out of that. One, were you a collector from the beginning, those early issues of 2000 AD and Warrior? Do you have any of those back in a basement somewhere, or?
I didn't have the room for them. I used to. I feel a bit bad about it, but I used to have like shelves in my bedroom. I would get these. My parents, I think, probably steal like big box file folder things from work, and I would have all of my 2000 ADs like arranged in order in these box files on my bedroom wall shelf, and like I'd label them with the prog numbers on them and stuff, you know. So yeah, I would reread those a lot, you know. And I hadn't read that early stuff for decades now, but it's still like the good stuff is still imprinted on my brain. Occasionally, I'm down the pub with my friend Paul, and we'll just kind of make some passing reference to some, I don't know, like a Future Shock or something that we read in the early '80s that we haven't read since, but it's kind of imprinted on our brains. Like I guess when you're a kid, your brain is kind of very malleable, and you know memories really stick with you from that time. I can't remember anything now, but you know, like you know, from now. But those, yeah, I mean that stuff really put me on the path. But I didn't keep them. I just didn't have room for them. You know, as you get older, especially when I went to university, um, you know, kind of moved out of home, my parents' home for the first time. It's like, you know, I hadn't got the room for them, and I
Yeah.
was rereading it less. And this was, I guess, the early '90s, like yeah, so around 1991, I think is when I went to uni. And I think 2000 AD had kind of gone off the boil a little bit. It wasn't kind of hitting the sweet spot the way it had for me before. And I think that was around about I don't know if Vertigo existed as an imprint yet, but certainly the influence of Swamp Thing and Sandman was starting to be felt in DC Comics. So lots of the like X 2000 AD creators were making more kind of interesting, kind of mature readers American comics. So I think I was gravitating towards that stuff at the time. So yeah, and you know, and I was broke, so I sold my collection of 2080 and my big stack of Warrior, which I kind of like. And funnily enough, recently I've been thinking I might just see if anybody else is selling off a Warrior collection because it would be nice to go and reread some of that stuff in the original form, you know, before it got messed around with. And there's a bunch of stuff in Warrior that never got reprinted. I mean, the famous one's a Marvel Man, which got changed to Miracle Man for convoluted legal reasons,
Right.
and V for Vendetta, obviously. But there's loads of other great stuff in there, like sort of Shandor Demon Stalker was great, and Laser Eraser and Press Button, which was one of Steve Dillon's early books. It's kind of like about like a female assassin and a psychotic cyborg henchman in the future, kind of getting into scrapes and stuff. And it was kind of sexy and violent and funny and like, again, your parents wouldn't approve. And I don't, to my knowledge, that stuff's never been collected. I think an American company reprinted some of the early stuff and colorized it, but I don't think there's ever been a trade paperback of Axel Press Button. And I'd love to just reread all that stuff. Probably makes a lot more sense now that I'm not 13 anymore.
Well, I'm
I don't really have.
sure.
Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, I'm sure somebody on eBay has some sort of Warrior collection for sale. As to whether it's cost prohibitive or not, or if it's a full run or not, that's probably an open question.
I think I don't really have that collector mentality.
Yeah.
I've never been the kind of guy who kind of like keeps everything kind of bagged and boarded and graded and all that kind of thing. For me, it's about good stories and good art. You
Mhm.
know, I want to be taken on a journey in a story. That's really the only thing for me. And I'm not really that fussed about the delivery mechanism. You know, like whether it's monthly issues or I mean, personally, I would rather read a nice big trade paperback collection because I hate like I remember like reading things like well like Swamp Thing, Watchmen, Preacher, just that agonizing wait for the next issue. Like it takes 10 minutes to read, we have to wait a month for the next one. I'm like, I want to binge the whole thing. So one of the nice things about coming late to American comics is that it meant that there was this huge like history of stuff waiting for me to discover it. So and by which point it did start getting collected. So I could go back and dip into old stuff and read it all in one go instead of doing the monthly wait. But yeah, but like most of the stuff I did collect, I ended up selling the issues. I'd sell complete runs. Like the last one I parted with was Hellblazer because that was the one that was closest to my heart. I love Hellblazer. It's like a big influence on me. But I've got all the trade paperbacks, and I'm not collecting the objects of the comic. It's the story I want to read.
Right.
So I would rather have books on the shelf. I don't know if that makes. I don't know if that's. Does that make me a bad comics fan? I don't know. It's
No,
about story.
no judgment here. Everybody does comics in their own way. I personally am, very much into the story more than the object. And even though I have a decent amount, which I need to cut back on, individual issues, I'm very happy to read, trade paperbacks and just get the entire story and read it like a novel, you know?
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, they call them graphic novels. Like so, you want a novel's worth of content.
Exactly.
I called it content. God, kill me. Oh,
Oh, I know.
you know what I
Well,
mean? Yeah, you want a
yeah,
nice big chunk of story to get your teeth
right,
into.
right. Wait till we get talking about IP. Just kidding. I don't want to talk about that either. So you had these influential stories and comics that you got into as a kid, like we all did, and mostly stuck around with 2000 AD for a while at least until maybe things started to fall off. When did you give some thought, or was it even a conscious thought about getting into comics as a career?
Pretty early on, when I was still a teenager. I think when I was, and it was when I was before it was. I guess it was. I was about 15, I think. So it was around about the time I was discovering Swamp Thing. But I knew that I wanted to be a writer of some sort, whether it was a novelist or a comics writer or film or whatever. I didn't really know. Um, but I love making up stories. It was just my thing. It's the only thing I was ever good at school, and I just the only thing I ever enjoyed at school. And I wrote to lots of, well, not lots, maybe half a dozen writers at 2000 AD because I had no idea how to write a comic. I'd never seen a comic script. So I just wrote to about half a dozen writers, care of the editorial address, because this is obviously way pre-internet. This was like 1985 or six or something like that. And bless him, Alan Grant wrote back to me and included a copy of one of a recent issue Strontium Dog script. It was part one of Incident on Major Minor, which is basically Shane in space. Um, and it was amazing. And he signed it and wrote Newty's Rule, Alan Grant, on the script. And bless him for that. He's helped a lot of people, Alan Grant. He was a really good guy, bless him. Yeah, so that was like, okay. So I got the script and I got the issue of the comic that had that in it. And then I compared it panel to panel to see, okay, so how, and I was amazed, I remember, like how little panel description there was for the artist to work off. It wasn't one of these long, complicated things dictating camera angles and stuff. It was just very simple, brief, almost like a screenplay. And I was like, oh my God. So that was the first time I realized how much the artist really brings to it, working from such a sparse but evocative panel description. Then Carlos Esquerra just kind of brought it to life in this amazing way and breathed life into the characters and the expressions and stuff like that. But I think I sometimes, overwrite like characters' expressions in my scripts. I think I should trust the artist more to just, get the mood of the characters. Yeah, so that was that was a big influence on me, realizing it wasn't some weird mystical magical process. Like, okay, it's actually a very practical nuts and bolts thing, and I approached it in quite a practical way. Like literally counting how many panels can we fit on a page, and how many balloons can we fit in a panel, and how many words can we fit in a balloon. I was literally went through the whole like a whole issue of 2000 AD, working out the averages for each story. Just like just to hit a sort of ballpark figure, which ended up being very similar to the advice Alan Moore gave that I didn't discover until like 10 years later. But advice he'd been given by an American editor on same thing, panel count and word count and stuff. Okay, I guess I was going about it the right way. Yeah.
And so did you want to break into comics as a writer, or because you it looks from looking at your biography that you started off in editorial, but often writers do start off in editorial and then make their way to writing. Were you casting about with scripts and going and looking for editorial jobs at the same time? How did you kind of land at that first gig?
I was going through the process of trying to of sort of pitching stories and like putting together submission samples and stuff like that. I was working as like doing admin at a university in London, and I'd got the password to the web server in the early days of the internet, which allowed me to, even though I wasn't like a tech administrator, I piggybacked on the university department's server and created my own website using like very, very basic HTML, which I would use as an excuse to interview kind of writers and artists and stuff like that. Like I was running a web zine. I guess this was like about 1996, something like that. So early days of the kind of popular internet. And it was by interviewing somebody there that I heard that there was an editorial job going at 2000 AD. They'd advertised it. I just in the Guardian or whatever, but I hadn't seen the advert. But I had been, literally going through the process of putting very short pitches together for 2000 AD. And I think I ran them past Alan Grant, I think, just for his advice. What do you think? Which of these might work? He's always very big on helping the little guy. And it was as I was in the process of kind of like trying to get that together and turn it into actual scripts to submit that I heard about this. Like it wasn't even an assistant editor; it was like an office assistant in 2000 AD editorial. But by this point I had done my university dissertation on comics, and it was on comics form and technique, storytelling techniques, rather than so it wasn't a fanish thing; it was more technical. And I think that's probably what got me an interview at least for the job. And then I just babbled at them about this stuff, and I brought a copy of my dissertation, and I ended up getting the job. But that was I think September 1997 when I started in the office at 2000 AD, and that was kind of like, I was about to say it was like a dream job, but it wasn't even a job that had occurred to me existed before I heard it was available. I've never had any interest in becoming an editor, but it's my favorite comic. Like there's a job going, I would give it a go. And it ended up being really educational for me because I ended up working with well, basically some of my childhood heroes.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, it's John Wagner and Alan Grant and Pat Mills and Carlos Esquerra, and and I'm dealing with them on a daily basis now. So that was amazing. For me, I was only about 25 or 26 at the time. And the most educational part of it was getting all of those scripts in every day. Because like 2000, for your viewers who don't know, 2000 AD is this British weekly comic, which is an anthology. So a weekly anthology means you got 5 stories every week, each written and drawn by different people. So that's a huge turnover of material. So it's always kind of frantic. And there was just an editor and his assistant, which was me, and a graphic designer. Steve Cook was the designer at the time. And so it was high pressure, but seeing how script married up with art, we'd get like layouts from the artist and like, okay, has he left enough? So, one of the things that David Bishop, the editor, taught me was to check the layouts against the script, because sometimes the artist won't quite draw the same thing that's in the script. And so has he understood it? Is he conveying it? Is the main thing. But like, technical things like just, is there enough room for the speech balloons? Or is there enough room for the speech balloons in the correct order without the tails crossing and stuff like that? It's all of that very basic practical stuff was really useful for me when it came time to write my own scripts after I left, because I would always be thinking of the poor editor who's got to untangle things that don't mesh, you know what I mean? So yeah, so that was great. And seeing how all of the different writers, everybody has a slightly different style, you know. There isn't like a universal script format for comics like there is for screenplays, or at least there wasn't at the time. And so like everybody would have even a different layout. And some would write very verbose panel descriptions, and some would be incredibly terse. And I think I just kind of, it was, I think if I'd only ever read one comic script, I probably would have tried to copy that style. I probably would have tried to keep copying the script style Alan Grant had showed me when I was a teenager. But having read, like once I was there, I was like, oh, there's no one right way to do it, So I think after I left, and I still wanted to write, but it wouldn't have been appropriate to sort of hire myself to write for 2000 AD. But after I left, I'm trying to remember what was the first thing I did? Because yeah, David Bishop was very strong on like you shouldn't write 2000 AD if you're working there, because that's another. Previous people have done that, including David. But when David left, he carried on as a freelance editor of the Judge Dredd magazine.
Okay.
Let me get the order right. Yeah, before he left 2000 AD, I became the editor of the Judge Dredd magazine, which is a monthly Dredd-based anthology. So I got to actually commission stuff for that. And we had a big anniversary issue coming up, I suppose. Something 20th birthday, I guess. It would have been, can't remember, 10th, whatever. Anyway, I wanted to get like a big name artist to do the cover because it was an anniversary issue. And Frank Miller agreed to do it. But I didn't have the money to pay for a Frank Miller cover because he's obviously a very big deal. So I wrote a story for the Judge Dredd magazine, but didn't pay myself for it, just so I could, because we couldn't get any budget. The budget was always very tight and was constantly being cut. That's why we had to be reprints sometimes. But yeah, I just wrote a 10-page script so that I could save 10 pages of script money for the issue's budget and then put that towards the Frank Miller cover. And Jock, who is somebody who had been submitting artwork to 2000 AD, trying to get his foot in the door. One of my first jobs was to go through the big pile of artwork, literally about 2 feet high, of unsolicited art and script submissions from everybody trying to get their foot in the door. And Jock stuff, I remember, was like, I remember showing to David Bishop, like, check this out. And so, yeah, I think I'd already given Jock a couple of like short stories by that point, like Future Shocks or like a one-off Dredd or something. But like, so I asked him if he would be interested in drawing this 10-pager that I had written for the Dredd magazine. I was like, yeah, great. So we did it together. This story called Lenny Zero, which was only like, at least from the script point of view, was only basically intended as a money-saving measure. But the readers liked it. And then time passed and David Bishop left 2000 AD, but carried on as a freelance editor. And so I inherited 2000 AD. I'd been promoted to editor eventually after a couple of years. So at which point, David was freelance editing the Judge Dredd magazine, and the readers liked Lenny Zero and had asked for more. So at that point, he commissioned me to write more Lenny Zero, and Jock came back and we did more of that. So that was cool. So I think that was probably my first paid job writing. And it was really nice getting to do it with Jock. Because, we were both kind of young and foolish and had no idea what we were doing, but we knew that we had, we loved the same stuff. Jock's always such a pleasure to work with because he just kind of gets it. You know what I mean? With this, I don't have to over explain stuff in the scripts because he just knows how to make a moment work, and dramatic and make like a look or a moment or an action scene, really pop off the page. So that was a very good experience to kind of put me on the path to actually doing this properly. And I think I'm always really self-conscious about my work. I kind of can't bear to reread it. But the fact that the readers liked Lenny Zero enough to want more of it kind of gave me a little bit of confidence. Like, okay, well, maybe I actually can do this, for a living. And I think by about the end of 2001, I'd kind of had enough of editing. I'd done what I could, what I felt I could with 2000 AD, but I didn't want to do it forever. And I had my own stories I wanted to tell, so I went freelance and started pitching to Vertigo and stuff like that. And that led to, I tell you what, the best bit of advice I ever got. I asked Garth Ennis on advice for pitching to DC and Vertigo, and he recommended Will Dennis. That's the best piece of advice I've ever got from anybody. Thank you, Garth. I know you won't be listening to this, but yeah, no, that was great. So I did. I wrote to Will Dennis and said, introduced myself and pitched him some ideas and so on. And he couldn't accept the ideas because they were for like create your own things, and I was nobody. So like, you need to kind of prove your chops to get a create your own book, which is fair enough. But he did offer me the chance to pitch for Lady Constantine mini. It was like a Sandman spin-off. And that was my first thing for DC with Grant Suzuka. And that led fairly swiftly to both the Losers and Swamp Thing reboot. So it kind of felt like jumping in at the deep end because, I've talked about what a big influence on me Swamp Thing was and how I kind of followed all that stuff. And then gone through 2000 AD, as editor, which was kind of, how did I get here kind of feeling. And now I'm working at Vertigo and they're offering me a chance to write Swamp Thing, which was the thing that kind of made me want to write comics in the first place, and that was exhilarating, but also kind of scary because I thought like, there's got to be somebody better to do this than me. But I think they just liked the fact that I was sort of young and enthusiastic, and would do as I was told mostly. Yeah, so that was like the Swamp Thing book was originally only meant to be a mini series. It was called Bad Seed, and because it was only meant to be 6 issues, I figured, well, rather try and do some completely new thing, I wanted to kind of reset the continuity a little bit so that they could get Swamp Thing back to to a position where they could start after the mini. They could start with new issue 1, where it's Alec Holland, plant guy, and you don't need to know any continuity. I always find continuity a bit of a pain. And so, yeah, my story was just about disentangling Swamp Thing from various continuity related things that had basically turned him into the planet Earth. It's kind of cool, but there's a cool place to end a story, but a difficult place to begin a story. I'm sure Alan Moore could do a great job of it, but I'm not Alan Moore. And I wanted to get back to a kind of horror vibe to it as well. And DC liked it enough that they asked me to keep going with it, and which again is very flattering. But I kind of I was quite honest with Karen Berger. I said, like, if it was going to be ongoing, I probably wouldn't have told this story. I probably would have started the story where the continuity had been reset rather than,
right.
All this disentangling I've been doing. And I didn't know what happened next. I kind of felt like the story I was telling had finished. And I'm not one of those people who's got like a million stories with Swamp Thing he wants to tell. I kind of felt like I was done. I'm never very good staying on books, probably because I've got the attention span of a goldfish. So yeah, but I exited gracefully, and then other writers followed me. But I don't think the book lasted a super long time. I think it kind of felt like Swamp Thing had its time, possibly. Hopefully that will change when the movie comes out. We'll see. I'm rambling again. Did I answer your question?
No, it's great. I'm sort of ticking off all the questions I had that you're just answering in more of a monologue form. But it's all great stuff. But I do want to rewind just to a few things to touch on. One was that it seemed like, and to your own admission, coming out of 2000 AD editorial and sort of launching your writing career, it was very organic, and within a couple of, I think, short stories, you're already working on some of your favorite characters growing up at Vertigo. I mean, were you sort of caught up in the I don't know, this sort of enthusiasm of that? Did you ever have a time to sort of step back and be like, wow, this whole writing thing is maybe not easy, but I mean, I just got right into it, and it's sort of going really strong right out the gate.
It did, yeah. Like the writing, has never come easy for me, but I did feel very lucky to have got such an easy time getting into the American market. Like I said, that pitching to Will Dennis was the best advice I ever got. But I think it's just because you pitch to the people who publish the stuff that you like. Because it's going to be appropriate. It means they're probably going to have similar tastes. And Will was editing all kinds of stuff I really liked at the time. And he was just his whole vibe is he's more open to, coming in from a slightly different angle, different tastes, I guess, some of the mainstream. But I did feel like I remember me and Jock discussing this. We were very kind of young and hungry and wanted to show what we could do. I thought I knew everything, even though I was completely inexperienced. And so I think I made all my mistakes in public under a spotlight, because like I say, I don't like to go back and reread my stuff. And I'm sure if I went back and reread that stuff now, it'd probably make me wince. I should read it. But I think I was so worried about losing people's attention or interest that I kind of would write in this very dense, fast-paced 2000 AD style. Which makes like one of the reasons The Losers is such a relentless kind of machine. Is because I was writing as if it was a 5 pages a week 2000 AD story where you've got to try and pack in as much bang for your buck in that limited space. And I think it probably, in hindsight, it would have benefited from just letting the characters stop and breathe a little bit more. But but people liked it. It's funny, I've become a lot more verbose as I've got older. Now I just want to let the characters stand around and talk. And there's a lot less gunfights and exploding helicopters, although I still do enjoy doing that.
Where did the idea for The Losers come from, or where was the kernel of that story and where you took it?
Well, again, was one that started off as a miniseries. Just pitched it as a miniseries, and it was Karen Berger who invited me to turn it into an ongoing, which again, very flattering but slightly terrifying because I think part of my problem is that at the time, not only I'd never written anything long form, but I didn't really follow long form comics particularly. All of my favorite stuff was fairly contained, beginning, middle, end. I guess Swamp Thing is probably the one book I'd read that really did follow these very long narrative threads. And I kind of didn't really know how to keep it going. Okay, the basic principle is this: like with The Losers, that wasn't like a cold pitch. That was like me and Will Dennis trying to, he knew that I wanted to do something kind of crimey and thrillery and actiony, which was slightly different vibe to most of the Vertigo stuff. But I think Brian Azzarello and Eduardo Riso had kind of kicked open the door with Johnny Double, which was this great little 4-issue miniseries based, I think, like a character who was in like one issue of Showcase, something like that. But but it makes him a DC character. But I'd never heard of Johnny Double, but like what they did with it was great. So me and Will kind of racked our brains trying to think of some obscure DC character like that we could revamp. I could turn into a kind of action thrillery kind of thing, because that's the kind of story I wanted to tell. And some of the stuff I'd originally pitched Will was that kind of flavor. It's kind of Elmore Leonard with more explosions kind of vibe to it. But we couldn't find anything. I kind of went through character encyclopedias and stuff like this, and just having a really hard time. And then one night, or one evening, Will rang me up. I was in London, he's in New York, but he rings me up and he says, "Have you ever heard of a character called The Losers?" And I said, "No, but it's a great title." just the title, The Losers, like, okay, I automatically want to write that, because it just immediately you think of the underdogs, and your heroes have got to be underdogs, otherwise where's the threat, and so of course I jumped online and looked it up, and what I learned about the old 60s, 70s Robert Kanigher Losers comic, like those who don't know, that was like a World War II platoon basically, was that they're all supposed to have died at the end of World War II, apparently. In continuity, like the last day of the war or the day after the armistice or whatever it is, I can't remember. And I thought, okay, well, but we want to do something kind of crimey and not necessarily a war comic. And I think that Garth was already doing like war stories at DC, and Howard Chaykin was doing American Century, which was kind of a 50s
Hmm.
grimy kind of thing. So my original pitch was like, what if the losers didn't die? But at the end of the war, they'd smuggled some Nazi rocket scientists out of Europe and brought them to Los Alamos to work on, missile programs and stuff. And then I thought, what if but they didn't die, but they were just believed dead, like killed in action or missing in action. And then they all regroup in the 1950s to pull off a caper, which is to find this hidden cache of Nazi gold. The only guy who knows where it is the rocket scientist at Los Alamos that they lost buddies getting out of Europe. So they're going to have to go and break him out of like this heavily guarded, nuclear facility. So it would have been like a caper, like Ocean's 11, but set in the 50s kind of vibe to it, kind of a post-war vibe with ex-military guys. And I still kind of like that idea.
Yeah.
But but like I say, Garth was doing war stories and Chaykin was doing American Century, and I felt that a 50s crime thing is with military guys is too similar to those two books at that time. Okay, so I was like, okay, well, what if we just? Well, Will said, well, what if you just keep the title and throw everything else away? Just update it, put it in the present day. Okay, cool, even better. Let's do that. Suddenly it had all this leeway. So I kind of did something with the next pitch for it was, again, just a self-contained 6-issue mini, but that had more of a kind of Three Kings vibe, if you've seen that movie. It
Yes.
was kind of set in like Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. But again, it was kind of a caper chasing, gold and all this kind of stuff. And then they asked me they liked what I was doing with these kind of successive, refining these pitches and so on. And then they asked me to make it ongoing, at which point I'm like, oh, okay. And it's like, it's a good problem to have, but it's still
Right.
kind of like I said, the way my brain works is stories have a beginning, middle, and an end. And I didn't have the skills to plan long form stories because I just didn't have the experience. And the problem with a caper is it's a very structured kind of story.
Yeah.
A caper has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You have the guy, and then he puts together the team, and then they do recon, and then they figure out that this thing is impregnable, and then they figure out how to do the heist, and then they pull the heist, but then something goes wrong, and they all frantically improvise, and then they finally get out by the skin of their teeth, and either they've got the MacGuffin or they haven't. But either way, the story's over. And then it's like, how do you make that into an ongoing? And then I realized, well, I just make it an ongoing series of capers, is
Right.
what it is. They need one overarching MacGuffin. Okay, what if the overarching MacGuffin is a guy? It's a man. It's the bad guy. It's Mac's character that they're chasing after. So like I kind of structured it so that each like mini several issue story would be like a mini caper in its own right, but it all built together towards into the hunt for Max. So I think I just about pulled it off.
I mean, I think it was highly successful, and certainly, as we know, Hollywood was interested and took the kernels of what you created and made something with that as well. Was that I'm sure that came later after the series was sort of done and you had moved on to other things, but was that validating to when you heard that that was going to happen?
Yeah, it was nice. Obviously it's flattering and everything, but I think partly it might also be because Hollywood could look at the losers and they could understand it.
Hmm.
Especially a lot of the stuff that Vertigo would put out is kind of like it's for us weird nerds. It's not necessarily for the man on the street.
Right.
So I think I've probably a lot of and Hollywood is like they make movies that are meant to be for the widest audience possible. It's not meant to be niche. I like Vertigo because it's niche. It's my
Yeah.
niche. So not everything is necessarily going to translate into like a 4-quadrant thing or whatever. But because with the losers, obviously, you can see that I'm influenced by Hollywood action movies and stuff like that in there. I'm channeling my love of Shane Black scripts and all the rest of it into the losers. So I think because of that, Hollywood guys can look at it and go, okay, I understand what this is. I understand the genre. It's a caper. Okay, we get it. So it's a caper but with more explosions and shooting. The A-team with a body count, whatever. So yeah, I just think they understood it,
Hmm.
and they cast it really well.
Yeah.
Oh
Agreed.
God, imagine trying to get that cast together now. superstars now. But it was a pretty low budget film. It only had a budget of about 25 million or something like that, compared to the A-Team, which had like 100 million.
Right.
So and they didn't have a lot of money for marketing it either. So it's a shame. It's a shame it didn't do better. But it has developed a bit of a cult following over the years,
Yeah.
especially as it's become more famous.
I think that was the beginnings of when Hollywood looked at anything less than 100 million that wasn't like a, cheap, thrill a second horror movie and said, I don't know if there's an audience for these movies anymore, which is a shame because there really is. But anything that is just sort of contained and mid-range budget-wise, not quality-wise, they for some reason are just not interested in anymore. And I think it's
I've
a real
heard rumors
shame.
that might be changing now. I
Yeah,
think
I'm
that
hoping.
because everybody's panicking about like streaming not making any money. But yeah, like
Yeah, yeah,
over the past decade, like Hollywood's been like, it's got to be a tent pole or nothing. Like you say, those mid-range films have dropped out.
yeah.
A lot of my favorite movies are those kind of, like mid-range. It's like they don't make dramas anymore,
Hmm.
or even just and horror is always really good for low budget because you get a big return on a film that didn't cost a huge amount to make.
Right.
Like now that and when they put all of their eggs in the one basket of making these giant tent poles, they have to succeed, and when they don't, they're going to take a bath on it. And I think they're between that and streaming suddenly not being the golden goose that everybody thought it was going to be because it was all just propped up by venture capitalist money. Um, I think the studios are now starting to go, maybe we should start make some more of those mid-budget and low-budget things.
Right.
I hope so anyway, because I mean, there's always a market for like dad thrillers, sort of, Taken or whatever, or and low-budget horror movies, and I love that stuff. I think everything I've written, you can tell that I'm channeling a love of various different genres
Sure.
and stuff. My influences are as much from movies and books as they are from comic books. So yeah, I hope that they do more of that kind of stuff. I just wish there was
Me
more of a
too.
comics market for those genres. There's like brief moments where it looked like crime comics were coming back and
Yeah.
western coming back. People still dabble in it occasionally, but just as a genre in comics now, it's very difficult to get anything going to really take off. It isn't superheroes. And of course, the big exception, of course, in the past decade was Walking Dead. Like,
Right.
who knew that was going to be the,
Yeah.
this juggernaut that it became. But again, I think looking back on it, you can kind of like, okay, well, it's for everyone. I mean, it's pretty adult, to be fair. But again, like you can give it to Joe Public, and they go, okay, I understand what I'm looking at here. This is
Yeah.
a zombie movie, in
Right.
comic book form, we get it. Funnily enough, actually, Robert Kirkman, it only occurred to me afterwards, he figured out the same solution as I did for The Losers. Like zombie movies are again a very structured kind of story.
Hmm.
They're usually siege movies
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
where you're surrounded by the horde. They're trying to get in the house. Way back to Night of the Living Dead or whatever. And we've got to get to the place where we can escape from the zombies. And they either survive or they don't. But either way, it's kind of I can't think of an ongoing zombie story I've ever seen before Walking Dead. I mean, even the Romero movies, there's
Yeah.
connected tissue between them, but they're each separate stories. And then Kirkman is kind of like, okay, like he figured out how to make it an ongoing series of zombie movies, I guess. He figured out how to make it long form rather than just get out of the house kind of thing. And then later on, when he came up with the idea for Thief of Thieves, again, like there was another ongoing caper thing. I wasn't the first writer on that. It was Kirkman's brainchild, but he brought in other writers to write each. It was meant to be like a different writer would write each arc of that book. It would be collected as trade paperbacks. And I came in for, I think it was the third arc. But again, it's like an ongoing series of capers. And it was only once I'd got my foot in the door that I discovered that nobody really knew where it was going. I assumed Kirkman had a master plan for the issue 50 kind of thing. Like, no, just, do your thing. And there'd been all this foreshadowing in the first two arcs about this big impossible heist they have to do in Venice. I'm like, okay, so you've got this build up and you've introduced these characters who are going to be involved. And like, so what's the plan? What are they doing? What are they stealing? And it's like, oh. So it's like, okay, right. So again, it was the I really enjoyed writing that because I like capers. But and I think Kirkman liked what I'd done with Thief of Thieves enough that he then asked me to keep going again. So like I was only meant to do one arc, but he asked me to stick around. So suddenly I'm back in the same territory as I was with the losers, but I'm like, okay, how do I do an ongoing series of capers? Especially about a guy who is like the world's greatest professional thief. It's like how do you keep that fresh without being repetitive? And there's only so many locks you can bypass and laser grids you can evade and stuff before, air ducts you can crawl down before it all starts to feel a bit samey, you know.
Right.
And I think I kind of, but I think that's the book where I started to get better at writing character rather than just action. The stuff, yeah, like some of the sort of the background character stuff, with the ex-wife and so on, and you just assume he's going to win her back because he's so cool. And I was like, oh, well, she thinks he's a jerk, and he's actually kind of been a jerk to her. So it's like putting myself in her shoes and putting myself in his son's shoes, rather than just having everybody worship this guy because he's so cool. It's like, yeah, but he's also kind of a jerk, and that's interesting because that's where the drama comes from. And I really enjoyed like flexing that set of muscles for the first time, I think, in a way that I wish I'd done more of in the losers.
I mean, it makes sense. I mean, certainly once you get past a certain amount of work that I guess, you feel like at least you've become proficient in, like action, I guess, that you'd want to stretch those other muscles and really get more into character. I'm interested, in fact, in that and sort of the evolution post Swamp Thing because, you go and do a number of different things that I think are different from each other and different from Swamp Thing. Things like Adam Strange, Silent Dragon, Green Arrow Year One. How did you, and even nowadays, how do you choose your projects? How did you choose your projects back then? Was it just sort of organically what editors may bring to you?
Mostly, yeah.
Yeah.
Like 90% of the stuff I've done over the past 20 years has been editors saying, hey, do you fancy writing so and so?
Hmm.
You know? And I've always been a bit of an odd fit in American comics because all the things that most people jump at, I will sometimes say, I'm not the guy for that.
Hmm.
I'm not like you crazy. I mean, I swear to God, Bob Schreck once offered me Detective Comics. It was a dinner in San Diego, yeah, a long time ago, early mid 2000s. Um, and I remember like just Jock was with us at dinner and Matt Wagner was there. I remember we were talking about Swamp Thing. And on the walk back to the hotel, Bob offered me the job as ongoing writer of Detective Comics. And I was like blown away, like really flattered. But I told him honestly, like, mate, thank you. If you ever want like a Batman mini or something, I would jump at that. But I'm not the right guy to write an ongoing Batman comic because I just wasn't sufficiently familiar with the lore,
Yeah.
the history and the characters and the continuity and everything. Because you really need to have that stuff. You need to love it and you need to have it in your blood. The way Scott Snyder does, for example. Um, but like I was kind of obsessed with The Dark Knight Returns and Batman Year One, which I still hold up as two of the pillars of modern comics. But in terms of, and I read Detective in the late 80s when Alan Grant and John Wagner were doing it, Norm Brayfogle stuff. That was great. But I wasn't familiar enough to really have a feel for it. So I didn't know back then that I had ADHD. I didn't get diagnosed till I was nearly 50. But
Hmm.
looking back, it's like, oh, that explains it. Okay, it's because I'm either passionate about something or I'm not. And if I'm not passionate about it, then I can't get my brain to engage with it,
Right.
you know? So there's all kinds of really prestigious and very flattering things I've been offered over the years that my brain just noped out. And I'm like, fortunately, I politely, gratefully turned them down rather than get into something that wasn't going to work because I couldn't engage with it. But when I got offered The Flash to relaunch from a new issue one, this is all a long, long time ago now.
Sure.
I've been offered Transformers, all kinds of stuff. And it's like, I'm not familiar enough with the material to be the. Guy for this job. Whereas other things, I know I'm jumping around in time, but there's other things where literally like last year, John Moisen of Boom Studios emailed me to say, I hear you like The Expanse. Would you be interested in writing a comic? And I was kind of like, leapt at it. Like, yes, let me at it. I think I drove John crazy, bless him. Sorry, John, by being such a fanboy about The Expanse. But that's something I can engage with because it's one of my favorite things, and that's so like it's not really a question of whether it's going to make me more money or sell more copies or, win more awards or any awards or whatever. It's just purely, is this something I'm enthusiastic about? And that's not something I can control, you know. But sometimes when they offer me something, I'm like, okay, let me see if I can come up with an angle on that. Um, which, like Shadowman, I never got to finish my run on Shadowman. It was meant to be a 24-issue run. It never made it. I think they killed it around issue 11 or something. And that's a real shame because I did structure out the whole 24 issues and I never got a chance to take it where it was meant to be going. And again, when they offered me that, I wasn't super familiar with Shadowman, but I went back and reread all the stuff. In Hollywood, they call it having a take on the material, but it's just like, for me, it's just like, can I engage with that in a way that inspires me, And I saw an angle with Shadowman to actually really get more into the voodoo stuff, which was the background to the character, and be a bit more respectful towards voodoo. But with Adam Strange, for example, they offered me that. Do you want to do something with Adam Strange? And I was only vaguely familiar with the character. I think probably first from his cameo in something, and some other old Golden Age bits and bobs, Silver Age. But again, like I like the idea. Actually, I have a lot more fun when you take less well-known characters who haven't been around for a while, because then you can spruce them up and change things and breathe a bit of fresh air into it, rather than just being exactly the same as it has been for decades. And Adam Strange was a good example because as soon as you say the character, you think of like the fin on his head and the jetpack and the planet Ran, and it's very Buck Rogers, very Flash Gordon. It feels very retro. I thought, well, let's do the opposite of that. Let's start it off that he's a kind of, a depressed alcoholic in Gotham City. Everybody thinks he's crazy, because it just won't be what people are expecting, and it just felt like, a good way to just introduce the character to new readers. Because I figured, like a big thing with me is always like, you've got to, I think Stan Lee famously said, you've got to assume that every issue is somebody's first issue. I like it when they have like a story so far thing in the inside front cover. I think everybody should do that. But yeah, so I figured like with Adam Strange, it was like, okay, if I can find a way to introduce him to new readers in a way that feels kind of gritty and engaging and fast paced and sort of funny, because I'm not the guy to do a sort of a retro pastiche. But hopefully at the same time, rather than suddenly gritting everything up, hopefully it still has that Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon kind of charm to, when he finally does get on the jetpack and battles aliens and stuff. You still want some daring do and stuff. But I had a really good time writing that book until the final issue. And Pascal Ferry did such a great job on the art. It was amazing.
No, he's phenomenal. Yeah.
That was he was a real pleasure to work with. So it just really varies. It all depends. There aren't many characters on my wish list. People always ask, like, so which characters do you want to write? Like I could tell them like a dozen stories I've got in my head that I want to write, but they're just not. It's my own stuff. It's my own character. Nobody's offering to pay me for that. Funnily enough, ironically I do now have a Batman story I really want to do. Like my brain, like I spent about a year obsessing over it. It's a Batman Joker story, and like on the one hand, everybody's sick and tired of Batman Joker because they're really overexposed, but on the other hand, everybody really likes Batman and Joker, and that's why they keep selling, So it's kind of, I don't know what the market likes, whatever. But I do know that that's the story I want to tell. So maybe I'll keep it in my back pocket for a bit,
Hey, we get to see that. What you mentioned having ideas for your own ideas for comics and for stories and characters, and you've done some creator owned. Are you interested in doing more of that or ballacing some more creator owned or original tales with
I've
doing
got a lot
work
of
with the
stories I
big?
want to tell. Yeah, a lot of stories I want to tell. The hard part is always paying the artist, because it's always kind of a roll of the dice whether anybody's going to buy the thing. I've only dabbled in a few creator-owned books, like me and Jock did Snapshot,
Yes.
um, which was a kind of 4-issue black and white crime comic, just a sort of fast little thriller that I really liked, but nobody bought it. We did an Image and it just vanished without trace. It's no, just couldn't get on anybody's radar with it.
Hmm.
I've had more luck recently with Cold Iron with Nick Brokenshire, which is a kind of sort of sinister modern day fairy tale, sort of like ancient kind of Celtic magic and fairy folklore in the present day with a slightly creepy vibe to it. And that's set in a place that's really close to my heart, the Isle of Man. So we did that as a digital book at Comixology, and then Dark Horse are now publishing the graphic novel, and that's fully creator owned, and that's what I'm really pleased with. And Dark Horse have done a really nice job on the collection. But for the most part, it's I mean, comics are expensive to make. That's the problem. The reason they cost a lot is because they cost a lot to make. Because
Yeah.
we've all got to make a living.
Yeah.
And like, people ask me how to get into comics as a professional creator, and I don't want to I don't, especially because I got so much help from writers and artists when I was starting out. I don't want to kind of dampen people's hopes. At the same time, it is tough to get by. I know a lot of I spent like 10 years living on my overdraft when I was a professional writer, and there's a lot of people just barely hanging on by their fingernails. So I think the bottom line is you've got to be really productive. You've got to work fast. You've got to
Yeah.
be able to churn it out. You've got to hit your deadlines, be reliable, and produce a large amount of stuff that's good. And that's really hard. Most people can't do that. I'm not productive enough. I'm really slow, because if my brain doesn't engage with it, then it's like pulling teeth.
Yeah.
Which sometimes drives my editors crazy. Sorry, guys. But so it's like it's not for everybody. I mean, just being able to make a competent comic is not enough to guarantee that you will have a career. It's kind of, I know it sounds a little harsh, but it's true, especially nowadays. But if you're genuinely passionate about it, and if that's who you are, then do it. Like, I mean, if that's who you are, then nobody can stop you anyway, because you're going to do it anyway. And especially now, when I was starting out, the internet wasn't really a thing, but now everybody can just publish their own stuff online enough to show to editors and so on, get noticed. And the more comics you make, the better you'll get at it. I always advise people to make lots of short comics rather than one big one, and that way, especially for writers, because that way you can work with lots of different artists, and you learn the art of brevity by trying to tell a short story rather than just, oh well, I need another 500 issues to get the story done. It's never going to happen. Anyway, sorry, I'm rambling again.
No, but you bring up an interesting point about all of that, which is that comics, as opposed to maybe there are other media where they're collaborative, but close collaborative um, medium, because you're not just writing a publication. The words can spill out of you, but they don't go just into the marketplace, as it were. I mean, it's interpreted and collaborated with an artist, and that takes both time and resources. And so that, I think, it makes it just a more difficult pathway, although probably I would say maybe more fulfilling with the end product. So I did want to ask a little bit about that collaboration with the artists, and you mentioned Jock a number of times, who you've worked with a number of times. What makes a good writer-artist collaboration? And how did you find that with Jock in particular?
Good question. I think I almost had it too easy when I was starting out, because one of my first experiences was working with Jock, and he did such an amazing job, and it's just such a lovely guy.
Yeah.
That it kind of spoiled me for everything afterwards. Like, he's incredibly talented and an incredibly positive person, and he and I just clicked when it comes to translating from the scripts to the page, to the art page. Like I said before, he gets it. He can see what the moment is supposed to be and how it's supposed to feel, and he can express that visually. Which moments to pop, when to zoom in close, and when to pull out wide, and we need to see the look in this guy's eye, or we need to see the exploding helicopter, or whatever it is. But sometimes you just don't know what you're going to get. a lot of, especially working for, on company books, like ongoing company books, sometimes you don't know who the artist will be when
Mm.
you're writing a script. I mean, ideally, it'll be somebody, who and whose style and you can play to their strengths. I mean, I usually try to ask an artist when I first start working with them, like I say, here's my process. Does that work for you? But what's your process, and what do you want to draw? And, I'll make suggestions before we start. Like with the Expanse, I suggested, we know a lot of non-comics fans are going to be picking up that book because they're fans of the books and the TV show, but they might not be used to reading comics. So early on, I suggested, well, why don't we keep the layouts nice and simple? Lots of kind of widescreen slot panels and so on. So it's very easy to see panel progression. Just to make it, so hopefully it's not the sort of thing that people will notice, but it just makes it a slightly, slip down a bit more easily for people who aren't super used to reading comics. But sometimes you won't even like. There've been times when I've written issues that I just don't know who's going to be drawing it, and sometimes it might end up being somebody who doesn't speak the same language, at least not that, not as a first language. It might be translation issues or whatever, and sometimes it'll be somebody that just sees it completely differently. I think with one of the reasons me and Jock work well is that I think I've got a movie playing in my head, basically, when I'm writing. I can see it very clearly in my head. Not everybody can visualize things clearly. There's other things I'm bad at, but one of the things I'm good at is being able to visualize the scene, right down to from characters' expressions to the spatial geography of where they were standing in a room, so that I know that when this guy punches that guy, the gun's going to fly over there and land under that, go through that door or whatever, and that knowing that having that kind of like mental image in my head, I can put relevant information in for the artist in advance to let them know, okay, there's a door behind this guy. I know it seems trivial to mention it now, but it's going to become important in 2 pages time or whatever it is, and Jock would always he would see what I was getting at, and he just gets it and expresses it. Other times an artist might just, I mean, I've had, I don't want to denigrate artists, but there have been times where like I think I've been pretty clear in the script, and the script is kind of very, I don't like writing overlong panel descriptions. I try to keep them reasonably brief, but that means that everything that's in there is important. Everything's like, the only reason I've written something down is because it's something that should be expressed in the art. It's not me indulging myself, So it's kind of condensed and distilled down, and then but sometimes the artist will just draw something else. It's just, or just a wildly inappropriate expression on somebody's face. They're delivering bad news, but he's drawing them laughing or something, and it'll just be like, I don't really know whether, well, maybe it's my fault. Maybe the script isn't clear, But I think certainly with like emotional context, it should be clear. You shouldn't have to try and describe the look on somebody's face or something like that, So yeah, so sometimes it's just the luck of the draw. But I think to answer your question, I think the key to good collaboration is communication. When you don't even know who the artist is going to be, and you don't have any contact details for it, just give it to the editor, and then something comes back. Okay, great, or not, whatever. But ideally, I will get in touch with the artist before we even start, and just kind of get to know each other a little bit, and give them my phone number, and just say, you okay with this? You tell me if there's anything you want to do, and just kind of like, figure out how we're going to gel,
Yeah.
Because it's a partnership, it's a collaboration. It's not like I'm the artist's boss or something.
Right.
Because like it's not the artist's job to express my vision. The first thing people see is the art. It's the artist who is expressing the story. So yeah, you have to. I think the more you communicate together as a team, the better. The more things come together.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's what we've heard from others, and yeah, communication is key when it comes to collaboration, especially in a medium like comics. Well, Andy, there's a lot of other corners of your career that we have not covered, so we might have to have you back. But I did want to get to the new project that was just announced that is coming soon, which is Elseworlds, which is kind of a resurrection of this imprint, I suppose, or a corner of the DC universe where they're taking, telling sort of stories that are tangential to the normal, I guess, continuity, imaginative stories. And you're doing one of the premiere issues or premiere stories, which is Gotham by Gaslight, which was the original Elseworlds tale. This one called the Kryptonian Age. Can you tell us a little bit about Elseworlds and about this tale itself?
Yeah, it's really exciting. I'll tell you what, I'm having so much fun writing it. Yeah, no, it's how did it start? This was fun. It started by me turning it down. You know how I said
It's
earlier
great
on,
projects too.
people have offered me stuff and I'm like, I'm too busy or I'm too stressed or whatever. And at the time, I just done a one shot like Red Hood thing for Ben Abernathy at DC. I love Ben. And I said, you know, you're looking for anything else? And he said, well, he told me that he would really wanted to bring Elseworlds back, and he was trying to get the guys at DC to go for it. And I was like, yeah, do Elseworlds because I'd love to write some of that stuff, but not right now because I'm writing The Expanse, and it's like The Expanse was a really difficult technical project because there was anyway for reasons, and it was kind of using all of my mental RAM at the time. And I was like, okay, once I finish The Expanse, then um, I will be all over Elseworlds. So like, let me know what kind of thing you're looking for, or what you're not looking for, because somebody else is doing it. And so he mentioned some other stuff that people were doing, but he wasn't really. I was about to say he wasn't really sure. I think it was more a question of just asking people what they wanted to do. And I said to him and this is just very off the cuff. It wasn't me pitching anything. I was like, well, if I was you, if I was in charge of Elseworlds, I would start off with the great granddaddy of them all, which is Gotham by Gaslight, because all we ever, you know, we got like the first Mignola Gotham by Gaslight was just a one shot with like no superpowers or science fiction aspect to it. It was basically just Bruce Wayne chasing a serial killer. It looked amazing. And then there was the sequel that was slightly more science fiction. There was the Master of the Future, which had a kind of Zeppelin with a death ray, but was it was more sort of tales of daring do kind of thing. But it was still centered entirely around Bruce Wayne and Gotham. So I said to Ben, and I was saying this to suggest he goes off and asks other people about it. I was like, well, if it was me, I would expand that world to see what's going on in the rest of the world. You know, what does the League of Shadows look like in 1893 or whatever it is? You know, is there a Wonder Woman? Is there a Superman? You know, what does Smallville look like in 1893? You know, it's like a little Wild West town, you know, Midwest settler town. You know, is Clark still there? Where's is Themyscira around in this world, or is it somewhere else entirely? You know, Green Lantern. I was about to say what I suggested for Green, because I was kind of like I was just riffing on ideas, and they kept coming. I was like, okay, my brain is engaging with this. I won't spoil what I'm doing with Green Lantern because I'm having fun with it, and I want readers to discover that for themselves. But yeah, just coming up with different angles that feel more kind of 19th century appropriate. And like Ben just emailed me back and said, dude, this sounds amazing. You've got to write this. I was like, yeah, I kind of realized that he was right, because just clearly my brain was just kind of throwing out so many ideas with this thing. It's like, yeah, it's something in me that I've got to get out. You know, like I said before about, you know, I can't choose what my brain engages with, and it just had already chosen to engage with it. Like, I guess I'm writing it, you know. So it's like, bless Ben, thank you, Ben. Um, so yeah, like I did not expect it to be the launch book, but it's the first Elseworlds book they're doing. It starts with Gotham by Gaslight, so that's very exciting. It's called the Kryptonian Age because I'm messing around slightly with Superman's origins in this. I'll warn people now, you're not going to see Superman straight away. I thought it might be fun to bring in influences that are more kind of appropriate to that 19th century period, you know, H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and so forth. And also later writers, you know, from the early 20th century, like Robert E. Howard and so on. Conan Doyle, obviously. And I figured because I've got so many different characters I can play with, I can bring in different influences for each one, and can I mix lots of different flavors together. Like when we go to Smallville, it feels like a Western. But when we go to John Constantine in Victorian London, then it feels like a horror comic, you know, with a little bit of black comedy thrown in. When we go to Arabia, It feels like sort of an old adventure story or something like that. And of course, Gotham is still Gotham. It's still very kind of grimy and crimey. Batman is still Batman. Yeah, so it's been a lot of fun being able to kind of mix and match all of these different influences. And it's a big story. It's going to be 12 issues, but we're splitting it into two halves. There's the first 6 are going to come out, and then we're going to take a little pause. And then when the trade paperback collection of those 6 issues is out, that's when the second half is going to start, because we're assuming in advance that lots of people are going to miss out. Not enough people are going to pre-order this, I suspect. It's going to be big. And so we want to make sure that everybody can kind of experience the full thing without missing out from the beginning of it. But yeah, it's again flattering but slightly scary. I get very flustered in the spotlight, like okay, so that thing I pitched to Ben is now launching a whole new line of Elseworlds books. So yeah, it's really exciting. I'm kind of torn because I really want to talk about certain aspects of it, but I don't want to spoil it for viewers. But it's got, and like I say, like basically the whole story is going to be introducing about a dozen or more well-known DC characters, heroes and villains. You're going to see like the 19th century JLA. You're going to see the 19th century Suicide Squad, Lex Luthor, and others that I won't spoil at this point. But I can't suddenly throw them all in right at the beginning. So it's going to take its time to establish and weave sort of threads together. I'm using John Constantine as in a similar way that he was first used in Swamp Thing. Like he's the guy who brings everybody else together.
Yeah.
And if he's not quite the guy who knows what's going on, he pretends to be the guy who knows what's going on. And this the Kryptonian Age thing, the idea, I wanted to make it feel less science fiction-y and more appropriate to those old 19th century adventure novels and so on. And I mentioned Robert E. Howard, I know it's from the 20s and so on. But the idea of the Kryptonian Age being like a lost age of the planet Earth rather than another planet. Now that's what people think of it as. That doesn't mean that's actually what it is. It's kind of like the science fiction is still there, but I'm burying it underneath a layer of like 19th century assumptions, I guess. So yeah, and like it's nice being able to juggle lots of different genres in this book because there's so many characters in it. Introducing Wonder Woman, I've had so much fun doing that Wonder Woman stuff. That's great, but I don't want to spoil her origin story in this. Constantine obviously is always a joy to write, especially when he's sparring with Queen Victoria verbally. Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
I mean, it sounds fascinating.
I
I was
you know
all
what?
in.
Sorry,
Go
go
ahead.
on. I was going to say I need to. I just realized I've been babbling about it, and I haven't mentioned Leandro Fernandez, the artist, who's
Yes.
doing an amazing job. Genuine. I know everybody says that, but genuinely, I'm really hard to please. And whenever I get his artwork, and it's like, oh my god, that is gorgeous. It's just the level of detail is extraordinary, and he's got this very rich style. It's got sort of high contrast with deep shadows and beautiful composition. He always chooses really interesting camera angles and so on to like maximize the dramatic impact of any moment. And I will write these. Art is so much harder than writing. I've got it easy, and I will sort of describe some complicated angle with 17 different things in the background, and here it is. He makes it look easy, and it's just gorgeous. And it's colored by Dave Stewart. We kind of
He's
agreed.
great.
We said early on, like me and Leo met up at a pub in London when he was visiting with his family. So we spent an afternoon down the pub just before I'd even started writing the first issue, just doing the whole getting to know you thing. And we just clicked. Sometimes you just click with an artist, and I just talked about all of my influences and the way I prefer to go in a particular style and everything. He was like, yes, me too. And everything he suggested, I was like, yes, me too. It was like, okay, I think we're on the same wavelength here. And one of the first things we agreed was like a flat coloring style would be ideal for it. Something that doesn't look like high tech sort of computer coloring, but like a more almost old fashioned kind of style. I mean, obviously, Dave Stewart had been, has done loads of work with Mignola, does a lovely job on Hellboy. That high contrast style of Mignola's works very well with that flat color style. So we both agreed, yeah, like in a perfect world, Dave Stewart should come in. Now we know we probably won't get Dave Stewart because he's a big deal and we're not. But aim high, miss high. And Ben Abernethy was going, I don't know if you're going to get Dave Stewart. He's super busy. And then we got him.
Nice.
Yeah, and Matt Hollingsworth is doing the later issues as well. Matt's amazing. Again, and also a lovely bloke as well. And yeah, and Simon Boland is lettering it. Simon's my favorite letterer. Like I always request him nowadays, because it's so important to have good lettering. And
Sure.
it's such a subtle art that everybody thinks they can do it. And sometimes you look at a book and it's like, ooh, what went wrong? But with Simon, it's everything's balanced and beautiful and it flows. And the lettering's important on this one because I really wanted to kind of lean into that 19th century style of dialogue, slightly highfalutin and slightly, wordy and a little. So it kind of starts off. One of the first things we see is like a sort of a posh soiree for rich VIPs, and it's very conversational, and I want the readers to be going like, is the book all going to be like this, And then of course, Catwoman appears and we're off to the races, and then Batman swoops in and blah blah blah, and it's so the lettering is really important to, like, the marriage of script and art and lettering. Like, is there room for the dialogue? Does it flow? All of that. I'm always like a real stickler for the kind of technical stuff because that's all about the reader's experience. That's the bottom line. Are we making this work for the reader? So we've really poured over this to make it work, and it's been really fun playing with the contrast between this kind of genteel, highfalutin society stuff, and then suddenly, boom, Batman smashes through the window, and I get to write a crazy action sequence, sword fights on top of steam trains and this kind of stuff. It's I get to flex lots of different muscles. I got to write like a Wild West gunfight the other day, like a Mexican standoff right in the middle of the thoroughfare, and it's just like I get to do all of my favorite things in one book. It's great. I love it. And Constantine got everything.
Yeah, it sounds like the culmination of like everything we've been talking about and all your experiences and all your artistic desires and motivations is like all culminating in this book. So we can't help but get excited when the creators are that passionate and excited about the projects.
You can tell when I'm excited about something. Like I'm very bad at faking enthusiasm, but when I'm genuinely enthusiastic, you can tell. So this is.
How about that, Banditos? I really enjoyed, as always, talking with Andy. He has a lot of stories to tell. He has been in the industry for such a long time and has seen, a number of his projects make it from book to screen. So that's always interesting to talk about. And yeah, I am just super intrigued by that new project, Gotham by Gaslight, Kryptonian Age. He dropped a ton of little tidbits for us to look forward to. It's a series, it's not just a one shot, so keep picking it up, and I can't wait to see where it goes. But that will do it for this episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for rating 5 stars, reviewing, subscribing, all those things that get us in front of more listeners and more viewers. We truly appreciate it. Please take a look at our next episode, which comes out Friday, and we'll see you then.